Welcome, everyone, to our latest Cornwall Insight podcast. Now, today we're going to be discussing one of the most fast-moving areas in the energy market, an area where business supply and PPAs come together. And we're going to be talking about the innovations that are going on there, the benefits that they can bring for consumers and for power producers. And we're going to be discussing that with a couple of experts here. Our own Tom Andrews from Cornwall Insight, and James Hall, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Evolve Energy. Now, my name is Robert Buckley. I'm Head of Strategic Accounts at Cornwall Insight, and I'll be the host of today's podcast. But what I'd like to do before we start is introduce our two experts. So, James, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Thank you, Tom. Glad to be doing this podcast, and thank you for setting this up. So, I'm James Hall. I've been in the industry for coming up to 25 years now. Broadly spent 15 years in supply, in consultancy, and the last 10 years in supply with Evolve Energy. Evolve Energy, we are a non-domestic focused supplier in the industrial and commercial sector. And a key standpoint of where we're at right now is assisting our customers on their pathway towards decarbonisation and the complexities that comes with integrating renewable energy into their supply positions.
I'm Tom Andrews. Very glad to be speaking on this podcast. I'm a senior consultant here at CI and been working with the business for coming up on 9 years. Most of my day-to-day work is in the investment space, looking at transactions and new investments. But I've also worked extensively with both generators and suppliers on the license exempt supply route, as well as the class exemptions for the requirement for an electricity license more generally.
Now, it's fair to say that this is a very fast-moving area, and what we hope to do today is to set out the ground rules for a discussion that we hope to further on the 5th of November at our annual conference, the Cornwall Insight, where Evolve Energy is one of our headline sponsors. So if you like what you hear today, please do take a look at the agenda. It is on our website, and be assured that we will be taking forward a number of the ideas that are discussed today. Let's just have a quick overview. What we're going to be talking about here, in essence, is routing power, renewable power, from small generators to corporate consumers. And this is an area where opportunities are opening up for both parties on both production and consumer side to structure contracts that are different to those that have gone before. So many people in the market will be familiar with renewable back power contracts, whether through REGOs or other measures that have been through the years. This is an area that is different, and it is different in terms of the scale of those that participate, but also in the opportunity that's available. Now, what we will do through this discussion is we will set out how this has emerged now, what's been going on, and where we might go. But to get to the core, we do have to go into the electricity industry rulebook. So we're talking here around the concept of license exempt supply, which goes right back to the fundamental ground rules of the electricity industry as set out in the 1989 Act. In that act, a number of activities in the market are licensable, which essentially means if you want to do it, you've got to follow a rule book. Now, there is a supply license that sets out many things, how they trade and how they deal with their customers, including you and I at home. Now, historically, there have been areas that have been exempt from the need for a supply license because essentially they don't touch on the mainstream market. Now, when we look at what's going on today, we're really looking at an iteration of that concept of license exempt supply. So first of all, I'd like to just ask yourself, Tom, how does this all fit together and why now?
So as you mentioned there, Robert, there are what we call the class exemptions from the requirement for electricity license, Order 2001, to give it its full title. That sets out a number of exemptions across the generation license space, the distribution license space, and what we're talking about today, which is supply licenses. So the pertinent exemption is the Class A, which allows a power producer essentially to sell the power it generates directly to end users without having to go and obtain a supply license. These license exemptions were put in place to enable certain business practices, certain sites to continue operating in the way that they had done before this new regime was put into place. This specific order for 25 years hasn't really been looked at and revised in that period. So, while it was put in place, it's now being used in a way to enable some new business models. The exciting thing that's happened this year is modification P442. And what that's done essentially is enable license exempt supply to be carried out over the public networks in a much more simple way, with more automation and simpler and easier data flows than ever has been the case before. So this isn't a new concept, but this modification has enabled more parties to access that in a much more flexible way than has previously been the case.
Just to pick up on there, Tom, P442, it's a balancing and settlement code modification. The balancing and settlement code is the industry rulebook for wholesale power trading, and it's the general context is that generation technologies have got a lot smaller scale and a lot more manageable since the days of the late 1980s when the supply license was first imagined, and the industry was in a very different place. So those are the principles. In terms of the opportunities that are there, James, on both demand and production sides, how do you guys see it, and how did you guys first alight on this?
Yeah, so I think just coming back off to what Tom had said initially, obviously we're talking here about primary legislation that's been inscribed for nearly 25 years. So, a key question is why now? Why is this gathering pace, 25 years or nearly 25 years after the legislation was passed? I think just as a quick potted synopsis of that, I mean, you go back to 2001 when the order was introduced, there was virtually no renewable generation feeding into the grid. So, whilst the legislation existed, nobody really was there to utilise it. Even if you fast forward sort of 10 years when there was more renewable generation coming into the grid and developers, getting up and running, a lot of those developers would have been required to have debt financing for those projects, and a condition of the lending would principally have been to sell that power through a long-term route-to-market PPA for 100% of the output. So the flexibility or optionality as to how the generators could sell the power was similarly restricted. So that sort of takes you forward into sort of 2020, where you've got established developers, established generators with revenues coming from existing operational assets. Now in a world where there's a lot more private equity investment in the renewable space, and effectively that's manifest a scenario where the generators now have more optionalities to how they sell the power. So we've already started to see in the last few years the tenors have started to reduce on PPAs. No longer do generators have to sell 100% of their output through a 10, 15, even 20-year PPA. And there's much more volume being left to the merchant market as the risk appetite of the generators starts to change. So that's really been the catalyst for why the exemption regime has sort of come to the fore over the last 5 or 6 years. So that's the opportunity really on the generator side, and in the broadest sense, the ability to tap into this legislation is increasing their ability to invest in the future of renewables. If you look at it from a consumer standpoint, there's a whole separate debate right now as to the long-term affordability of green energy, and that's certainly not for this podcast. But the speed of which I&C businesses are find themselves having to get into the renewable space with an authentic renewable solution, principally being that no longer will brown energy with REGOs traded over the counter and will cut it. Not for all, but certainly for some. Increasing supply chain pressure, whether that's through Scope 3 emissions, tighter reporting standards under SBTi, etc., that's forcing a lot of businesses to move into this space sooner than they might otherwise have thought they would need to do so. And of course, affordability is front and centre of securing the financial commitment from a board to move. So what the licence exempt regime is doing is it's serving as a facilitator to secure board commitment for these organisations to get into renewables.
So I think it's important to note also with the exemption regime, there are a number of costs that attach to a licensed electricity supply, so a mainstream electricity supply, if you like, one from the public network, from licensed supplier, and those centre around the costs of policy, renewables and so forth. And a license exempt supply does not attract those costs. Now we will come back to to that concept later in our discussion, because there are certainly views as to how important that exemption from those costs may be. They actually do run into several tens of megawatt hours, so can be a material component in the consumer bill. So that is an important element in the cost equation, but it's also an important element in the revenue equation for the generators, because essentially we're arbitraging around this money here, and actually that money, James, we were talking off air before the podcast, is actually very important to smaller generators looking to sustain themselves in this market in a post-subsidy world.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the hydro technology as an example, there's lots of debates going on presently as to what the future of that technology looks like if the ROC subsidies fall away. And at the minute, license exempt supply and the non-applicable costs that can have some value going back into the generators as a result of that could be a key part of the future viability of that tech. But it's not just sort of limited to hydro. I mean, whether you're an onshore wind developer, whether you're a solar generator, differing projects now have different sunk costs attached to them. Every project's different, and in some cases, this could be the catalyst that satisfies the required return on investment. But I think more generally speaking, if we sort of take it to a broader view, obviously you can talk about we can do, or class A exempt supply is applicable to both operational and new build generators. But certainly for the new build generators, the corporate space is really competing on cost with the impacts of the CFD regime. So if you look at the latest auction round 7, where the strike prices have been set, it makes it very, very challenging for corporates to get into the renewable space on an affordable basis, because from the generator standpoint, the strike prices offer a very attractive return with the benefits of having the government as the creditor, in essence.
And ultimately, all consumers stand behind the UK government paying the bill. I think you touch on an important point there, James, in that this mechanism, it's a market-based solution, and it actually opens up a route to another very potentially attractive source for generators, which is corporate balance sheets, where they can perhaps use those as a vehicle to fund repowering or investments that otherwise might not happen.
Yeah, and again, the Class A or the exempt supply regime under Class A can be the facilitator for a generator to go and do a deal with a corporate off-taker as opposed to a route-to-market PPA. And there's various connotations to why that's important. I mean, we're looking at a world now where the connections to the grid, or the grid connections, are going out sort of 5, 6, 7 years into sort of 2031, 32. And there's a lot more activity around buying and selling of assets. And generators need the certainty of revenue, and they get that through a corporate PPA. But against the backdrop, certainly for a new build, of the CFD regime, where they're in excess of 5 megawatts installed capacity, having Class A enabled PPAs is the catalyst for them looking at doing it with a corporate as opposed to a route to market.
And does that chime with your experience, Tom, with the work that you've been doing in this area?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the particularly for smaller generators where that 5 megawatt of instantaneous power limit, it means the benefits are more significant to the portfolio. So generators in that anything from sort of 1 to 10 or 20 megawatt space, where they perhaps aren't seeing the benefits of economies of scale. Extra revenue which can be provided by this sort of arrangement can be really useful in the business case and supporting those assets. We know particularly, for example, in future community generation, this might be a really important addition of support.
So having laid the groundwork, as it were, for the discussion, I wonder if, James, you could share a few of your practical experiences of working in this area, and especially around who is this most relevant to, and what have been the kind of entry points for discussion that you've been having with people?
Okay, so obviously we've talked about the the broader concept of license exempt supply becoming a facilitator from an affordability standpoint for non-domestic consumers to accelerate their transition into renewables. We first got involved with this back in 2019. Obviously, innovative, forward-thinking organisations want to find ways of accessing competitive advantage and finding added value. So the nature of our customer base meant that these were conversations that were happening some time back. Going back sort of 5 or 6 years ago, I think it's important to touch upon at this stage as well that when we talk about the non-applicable government and social policy costs, the administration of those charges is dealt with through different bodies. So the renewables obligation and the feed-in tariff, for example, is dealt with through Ofgem, whereas the contracts for difference, the capacity market, and the soon to be introduced nuclear regulated asset base levy, which comes in on the 1st of November, they're administered by Elexon through EMR settlement, and that's quite an important point, because the different operators of these subsidy mechanisms pre the enduring solution, which I'm sure we'll get onto, require different conditions in order for organisations, generators, and demand consumers to participate. So when we sort of look at it from an Elexon standpoint, 5 or 6 years ago, applications were going in through effectively submissions of reports, where operators had to demonstrate that they had generators covering import demand or matching to import demand at all times. Now, that at all times caveat is important, because that was the condition that Elexon imposed to ensure that they were operating in full accordance with their obligations under the BSC. And it is an important point to make, because the existence of an at all times requirement effectively requires the existence of baseload generation feeding into this regime. And of course, most generators, certainly of a smaller scale, will be intermittent generators. Again, as we look towards the future, I'm sure that batteries will become an increasing technology that provides optionality. But generally speaking, it all boils down to the fact that very, very little of this was happening sort of 5 or 6 years ago, and any applications were sort of being approved at the month end supplier volume allocation group meetings. I think it's also important as well to point out at this juncture that the exemption regime isn't limited to renewable generators. Talk here about baseload generators and not much of this happening. Of course, there were baseload generators participating under these types of arrangements. But for the purposes of where we've pivoted into this space, it relates around the sustainability requirements and the renewable solutions that our corporate demand consumers require. And therefore, we align our activity under the exemption regime solely with renewable generators, and it's conditioned around the affordability standpoint of giving that added value to then secure that investment. So again, the two different bodies, Ofgem and Elexon, both operated slightly different regimes. So whilst Elexon were requiring the at all times coverage, that wasn't a requirement for Ofgem, and therefore, in the formative years before the enduring solution came into industry settlement, a lot of participants were only engaged in license exempt supply for the Ofgem administered levies. And obviously, as we move into 2026 and beyond, following the introduction of P442, the introduction of the ESNA role will now make this scalable, such that the ability to match demand to generation whenever it occurs and not at all times is the thing that will allow more consumers to participate in these arrangements, as they've been wishing to do so now for a number of years.
So this is where VLPs and ESNAs come in. Maybe we could just elucidate on those acronyms for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So the ESNA, the ESNA, Exempt Supply Notification Agent. So this is a new industry role, which essentially takes the generation data on one side and the demand data on the other side, matches those up on a half-hourly basis. As we said, a 5 megawatt limit supplying to non-domestic customers, so 2.5 megawatt hours per half hour. There is also a slightly lower limit for domestic customers, 2.5 megawatts or 1.25 megawatt hours per half hour settlement period. And that ESNA essentially sits in the middle, collects the data streams and provides those through to BSC settlement, Elexon data portals, and essentially make sure everything is going through as it should. VLPs then being virtual lead parties, they have a trading and role as well, and potentially could act in some of these roles, either acting as the ESNA or the other generator off-takers, and helping facilitate these arrangements.
So essentially consolidating bunches of generation into the
and helping match
the
that up
settlement
to
system.
demand.
James, so when you talk your commercial structures with people on both the demand side and the generation side, is the conversation similar to what it would be like in terms of tarification and contract term for a conventional supply contract, or is it different? And do those differences kind of set rules for who should be having the conversations?
Yeah, I mean, again, what it boils down to principally is that because whilst we said you can do this with both brown and renewable generators, our principal focus is enablement with renewable generation. So typically, the conversations or participants that are doing this through Evolve will be those that require an authentic renewable solution, and this can be be part of that structure. An interesting point really from where we are, and again it's coming back to Tom's point he made there around the 5 megawatt cap in the non-domestic match, which is akin to 2.5 megawatts per 30-minute settlement period. A key standpoint clearly is that the generator can only match up to that level, but is not guaranteed to be able to do that unless the demand customer also consumes to that level. So we have arrangements where we do have a bilateral match with a single demand consumer to a single generator, but the principle is that if the demand consumer in any 30-minute given period, let's say, only consumes 1 megawatt, then even if the generator had produced over 2.5 megawatts, they can still only match to 1 megawatt. So the generator from that standpoint is looking to maximize their ability to match to demand. And one of the ways that we facilitated that, again, whilst looking at the whole accessibility conundrum for corporates in general around getting into the renewable space, there's probably another podcast on this actually with regards to the availability conundrum and the lack of access to renewable generators, whether that's through minimum volume requirements and or sort of covenant strength related activity. What we've effectively done with this is we're operating renewable consortiums that contain multiple demand consumers. And by matching multiple generators into multiple demand consumers, it is enhancing the ability for the generator to be able to match up to the very basis that they produce around the 2.5 megawatt limit. So if customer A, and that can be on an equitable basis, so if there's 5 demand consumers being matched to a single generator and they all consume 0.5 megawatts per 30-minute period, and the generator is producing 2.5 megawatts per 30-minute period, then the generator gets 100% matching to their allowance, and each of the demand consumers also benefit to the same extent. And that's been quite a neat way that we've been able to secure the generator's commitment to their 5 megawatt allowance.
So this is almost like a spin on the basket contracts or framework contracts that private and public sector intermediaries have taken to market on behalf of their customers over the years.
Yeah, so typically, yeah. So when we're looking at the licenses and supply, the principles involved around matching, you're dealing in a world where these arrangements have to take place within a flexible supply framework.
Uh-huh.
Now, those supply frameworks per se can exist to consumers can start with a plain vanilla solution, and as their ESG requirements evolve over time, they can then transition into different types of arrangements. The important point, though, is that a flexible framework is absolutely necessary in order to integrate what is largely intermittent renewable energy. And when you've got the exemption regime attached to that's also plays into the matching and the wider connotations for future matching in general. So to close the loop on how the structure works from our side, under these types of arrangements, it is Evolve Energy that is contracting with the generator as the off-taker and contractual party, and then we're exclusively allocating the volumes into the consumer. And typically what we've been doing now, certainly for the last 18 months, is we've been making it a conditions precedent of the PPA that the Class A enablement is a conditions precedent of go live.
So that essentially means that the exemption has to be in place before power can...
Correct.
can flow from any generator to any point of consumption. That clearly underlines how important the Class A exemption is. I think it's fair to say that there are critics within the industry in places who see this as merely a money go round and the avoidance of certain parties fulfilling their due obligations. What would you say to that?
Yeah, let's take an example of a customer where we've facilitated sleep PPA. That, in one example, that might amount to a financial commitment over a 10, 15-year term of, near on 80, 90 million pounds. And when that arrangement is integrated into their supply position and the bill goes out the door, the consumer standpoint is, why on earth are they paying for the government social and policy costs when they've already committed a substantial amount of their financial resources into their own unique renewable solution? And that's the general mindset that any business looking to get into this space is taking right now.
And I've certainly heard the argument made that this mechanism calls forward or even maintains on the system generation that would not be there because it can't get subsidy, it won't get subsidy, and therefore this mechanism is merely an adaptation of the market rules that allows things that we collectively have decided as a society are a good thing.
In essence, it's stimulating investment, certainly with the smaller scale generators. It could be the difference between a project making or breaking. And, if you look at this in the wider context, the 5 megawatt absolute limitation for generators matching to non-domestic consumers, that's at body corporate level. So, you could have an example of a farmer with a wind turbine at the top of his hill. If that happens to generate 5 megawatts, then he can do his 5 megawatts. But you could also look at the international wind developer that might have got 30 sites operating in the UK. They can still only do 5 megawatts at body corporate level based around how the funding operates. So the legislation is designed to ensure participants can tap into and secure competitive advantage, where they can facilitate those arrangements without it affecting the overall broader landscape.
We have a subsidy regime that is tailored to suit the needs of larger generators, particularly to develop bulk scale offshore wind and now onshore wind. Since the change of government, we've really struggled over the years to find mechanisms that support small scale generation, community energy. I mean, Tom, I know you've worked in this area for a very long time. So, what's the sentiment that you're getting back from people about this, particularly on the production and investment side?
As you say, Robert, there is very little support for those smaller generators. They have CFD access over 5 megawatts, but that auction mechanism really does reward those who get the most economies of scale, which is looking at sort of dozens or hundreds of megawatts to get those economies and therefore have that competitive edge in the auction. So yeah, for the smaller generators, whether it be a few hundred kilowatts or single digit megawatts, there is really a gap in the market for any way to support those and to drive those potentially very viable, potentially very useful projects forwards. I suppose the risk that comes in and the potential problem with this legislation, having been here for 25 years, is that people are interpreting it in different ways. There are certain grey areas, particularly around that body corporate, where definitions are not as well established as they could be. And that's where we see perhaps a need for review and update of that legislation and the definitions in there to make sure that this is being used in the way that which government and I suppose investors and people more generally would like to see it being used to benefit the generators, particularly renewable generators, where the support is warranted, and perhaps to restrict other parties from using it perhaps as much as might be the case.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, that, Tom, because if I think about the examples of enablement where we're doing this, there's certainly been a multitude of energy specialist lawyers involved around the legal framework where they represent the generators. That may be a good place to start, around the wider positioning. Clearly, the legislation is complex, but it's there in black and white, and those that have a good grip on it and know how the mechanics operate are the ones that have probably been doing this for some time.
Before we conclude with some thoughts on the future, I'd just like to ask the both of you that if we have listeners who think this may be something for them, what are the practicalities for each side, from the consumption side and from the generation side? What might people need to do before they have a conversation with somebody in the industry about this? What might they expect to be different from what they've done traditionally, either as a seller of power or as a buyer of power? And do they need to think a little bit differently about their roles as well? So, James, if I can turn to you first on those 3 points, what to do to prepare before you go to talk to somebody, what looks different in what they might be presented with, and what might they need to do differently in their day-to-day jobs?
It's a good question, Robert. I think the starting point is always going to be important, and I come back to the general company or board approach into renewables full stops. I say that against the backdrop of demand and supply. If I talk about what we're experiencing with our customer base, there is more demand for this than physical supply right now in terms of generation feeding into demand. And again, that's largely manifest through more and more businesses needing an authentic renewable solution, but struggling to get a board commitment based around the general affordability of renewable energy. So it's not like people can just turn a tap on and turn up and say, well, we want to do a bit of this. Can we go for it? I think it is absolutely fair point to say, though, that, whilst I've talked about a scenario where we're matching multiple generators into multiple demand consumers and therefore maximising the ability of the match, if a demand consumer expressed an interest in doing this and they had an effective baseload demand profile, then of course they are going to be highly attractive to the generator in respect of the ability to maximise the matching process. So there will always be some consumers of energy that are better positioned than others, even if they try and get into this space quickly. But I think from a practical standpoint, taking it right back to the sort of base level, it would be interesting to see how this market evolves in the domestic space when market-wide half-hourly settlement comes in full force, because ultimately the condition of matching is that you can only match half-hourly settled import demand MPANs against export MPANs. So that's a key standpoint. But the vast majority of that sector is currently purchasing under fixed price contracts. And the ability or lack of ability to integrate a Class A arrangement into a fixed price contract will be as big a prohibitor as the supply conundrum I've just talked about. So from a non-domestic standpoint, those businesses that are fully au fait with the contractual mechanisms of a flexible contract or contracting framework already have some idea as to how this will work in practice, and then it becomes an education piece. So it's very much a case of seeing where different companies are at, understanding what's important to them and how quickly they might be looking to get into this space. But it all really ties in with an underlying commitment on the consumer side to be looking at an authentic renewable solution with this as the enabler, rather than this as the mechanism in isolation to just give them some financial advantage. In addition to the supply agreement, to facilitate this arrangement, the generator in the role of exempt supplier has to sign a bilateral agreement with the demand consumer that is being matched to their generation, called a license exempt supply agreement. And that is the legal framework that aligns to the legislation.
So that there is an extra piece of legal documentation that needs to be in place to support this, but as things have gone on, this is something that can be readily explained to both parties.
That's right, and it's a relatively simple short form agreement that covers all the salient points required around the regs.
Okay, so it's not a vehicle to undercut a conventional REGO-backed supply contract, if that's what you've got.
I think the cost of REGOs, as we've seen over recent times, can be incredibly volatile. Right now, if you look at if you look at the front years, if it's the right use of term, the costs are arguably palatable to most. And again, if you've got businesses that don't yet need to move full force into a sustainability solution, then buying regos against conventional traded brown energy over the wholesale market might be fine for them. I don't see exempt supply as a sole means of replacing rego-backed brown energy without a further commitment to invest in renewables per se, because ultimately, where I take the example of us standing behind the PPAs, we're doing that first and foremost to channel authentic renewable energy into customers to satisfy their sustainability ESG. Whereas businesses that are matching bilaterally under, say, a sleeve PPA, again, they are first and foremost doing that for a sustainability solution. And this can be something that enables the agreement on both sides.
It's Tom, from your perspective, what do customers need to do to prepare? What might look different, and how might their roles be different? So if we can flip that onto the producer side.
Yeah. In terms of producers, I suppose that the main thing is to be aware that this is an option when you're going out to secure that PPA deal. We are seeing increasing numbers of PPA off-takers, including some wording in this contract, and perhaps not explaining it as fully as might be the case. So as James has said, that education piece, being aware that this is an option, how it works, what the requirements are as well. We know that there are different interpretations of certain regulations being put out there. So being aware of the potential pitfalls and risks, but also just being aware of the value that's on offer, the mechanics and overall PPA negotiation that helps you to set a fair price for your generation. And just as we've seen previously with things like embedded benefits, the more generators know about the values and the revenue streams on offer, the more of a fair deal they can get for their power, and the more they can integrate themselves into the markets to successfully get those additional generators down, built, and longer lifetimes for existing generation that we all need to see to get that the renewable transition completed.
I think it's fair to say that there are different levels of acceptance and understanding of this concept within the supply market, and it is changing all the time. Probably not talking too far out of school, James, to say that we see a very wide range of attitudes to this from different suppliers, and what you see one week will not necessarily be what you see the next, because this market is very, very fast moving, as we said right at the start.
Yeah, agreed. What you hear from sound bites doesn't always necessarily paint the actual picture, does it? And a lot of that might be around attempts to mask a lack of capability. But ultimately, the regime that's there, people want to utilise it. The existence of the P442 legislation from the election standpoint is now allowing more people to utilise that legislation for their benefit. And I think if you look at the way that the ESNA piece has worked under P442, and how that sort of aligns to the market design in general. The good thing with this is that it's allowing the parties that want to perform those matching services, whether that's per se or aligned to an ESNA service, to move ahead at a pace aligned to their own entrepreneurial spirit, rather than a market that's designed to move with the pace of the slowest operator. So there's a lot of change taking place right now with businesses, certainly from a software sophistication standpoint, looking to come into this. And I think this is what the exempt supply arrangements do, and the mechanisms as to how it all works. It's part of the overall sort of healthy debate around the future of matching demand to generation, and the other cost advantages that can bring through avoiding potentially volatile balancing costs, for example, where you've got the ability to match more and more consumers to smaller, medium, and large scale generators. So there's varying strands of the debate, but it's certainly an evolving space and one that's moving forward at some pace.
The industry, unfortunately, does have plenty of experience at moving at the pace of the slowest. But I do want to kind of conclude our discussion and pick up on a number of the themes that you've both said there, Tom and James, and that we've raised during this podcast. If I'm kind of taking the view that this is an innovative and dynamic area that offers targeted opportunities for generators and consumers who want to support a faster decarbonisation of the power system than is currently scheduled and legislated for, that it's not really going to go mainstream. It's deliberately designed to stay niche, but within that framework, there is a lot that can be done, and a lot of opportunity to pull forward new generation, enable carbon savings and cost benefits for on the consumer side.
The niche point is really critical. These rules will enable these new parties to come in, and they will enable these new business models, potentially tying into, as James has said, matching generation, true renewable generation with renewable demand from corporates. We could see that tied into new rules on REGOs, and potentially moving those certificates has been so often discussed into a more granular form, perhaps tracking these kind of arrangements of supporting more parties to become involved, and enabling things like storage as well, to perhaps move renewable generation from peak times to off-peak times, and actually tying that green power in and out of batteries and other storage assets, and providing, I suppose, the evidence on that granular basis, which also supports business cases to get that 100% matched, which is so difficult to do from intermittent generation without those flexibility resources.
A real mix of opportunities that could come together. I'm struck by your comments there, Tom, that centre on the provenance of the generation, and also the ability to shape more to the demand profile of the economy. It's a very, very big challenge to get and value power that is taken by consumers that is helpful to renewables generation and flexibility. And I think that, for me, is one of the unacknowledged values that consumers can bring, that ability to consume power from renewables generation and effectively route from the point of production to the point of consumption. James, how do you see the future when you're discussing these things with your colleagues at Evolve?
I firmly believe that the consumer interest in this will continue, both from demand consumers and generators over the coming months. More people will seek to participate in these types of arrangements, and again, it's largely centred around this being a key mechanism for enabling generators to continue their investment into renewables, and for corporate consumers to secure a board mandate to go with a renewables-based solution. I think there'll be an interesting change once the market-wide half-hourly settlement goes live industry-wide as to how types of arrangements might work in the domestic space. Because, of course, right now, that sector of the market is inaccessible to those by virtue of those meters not being half-hourly settled. And it'll be quite interesting to see what innovation exists around sort of tariffs for domestic consumers who, of course, don't and shouldn't have to understand the level of complexity within the market around the contracting frameworks that this is currently working under.
That's a great point on which to finalise our discussion, James. Thank you. The business market has long been the point of innovation that has taken new ideas to other consumers, small businesses, and ultimately to households. Thank you, James, for your time and your contributions, and likewise, thank you, Tom. We hope that our listeners have found this an interesting conversation. There is a lot of other resource that we have available that sets out the points here in more detail, including on the 5th of November, when we take up this conversation again at our annual conference. If you've liked this discussion and you'd like to attend the event, please do get in touch. You can find out more about Cornwall Insight Live on our website and on our LinkedIn and social media. The event is on the 5th of November in London. If you can make it, we look forward to seeing you. We hope that we've raised and enlightened people on what is still a very new and fast-moving concept within the market. Thank you for listening, and look out for us next time.